and you're good to go.
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see you all again. And what I'd like to do is, I have to take a deep breath. We're looking here at Old Testament eschatology. And I know you all have been looking at eschatology from various perspectives and kind of moving forward chronologically, right? So some New Testament Jesus and some New Testament passages, and then church fathers and so on. And in a sense, we're moving, I guess, backwards in time to look at the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. And that is a massive body of text with different types of eschatology. What I'd like to do is sort of two things. To start, summarize a couple of main points of, I guess, teachings from the Old Testament of the type of eschatology that emerges in the Old Testament. And I will be contrasting or comparing and contrasting with New Testament eschatology, since that's what has just been discussed in the past several weeks of this ongoing Bible study. And then I would like to zero in and look a lot more closely at a couple of passages from the Hebrew Bible, especially from Isaiah, one from Zechariah, to try to like feel in all of its complexity and all of its glory what goes on in these. One reason I want to look at the passages is that I find for the purposes of teaching, it can be useful to separate things and to put things under headings, like hopes for the nation, hopes for the Gentiles, hopes for a restored nature, like physical nature. Those are nice ways to divide things for teaching clarity, right? But one of the disadvantages of breaking things down like that is we may separate things that the original prophets had very tightly interwoven. And it might be that they wanted them interwoven, because in their minds, these things can't really be separated. There's a sort of a restoration of all these things at once. And so that's one of the reasons to look at a couple passages in some depth and see what's tied together and why might all these different ideas be jumbled together in a prophet? Like how can we get our finger on the pulse of the prophet Isaiah and what his hopes are for the end times? So if that sounds okay as a process, I want to start by asking a couple of you a question, because I've gotten emails from a few of you about eschatology in ways that set me back, where I was like, oh, we're all using the term eschatology with different meanings. So I'm going to call on someone by name. And if you don't want to be called on, you just wave me off. I'll call on someone else because I don't know you all. So I'm going to say, Melissa, if I ask you, someone on the sidewalk taps you on the shoulder tomorrow and says, what's eschatology? What quick answer do you give them?
The study of, I go into the study of the Bible in the book of Revelation, and how it relates to some of the end times and the historical data that is explained. That we had a class on it, that we've been taught by yourself, and you explained. I really like it. Was very relative for me when you explain the apocalypse as the liturgy. That really brought it home. Because a lot of times we think things have to be so out there and so foreign, and again, the kingdom of God is within, and heaven and earth unite, when we were talking about the holy holy and at the mass and everything. And so that's to me spoke volumes of what eschatology was for me when you explained it in that framework.
All right. And thank you, Melissa. And one thing I heard Melissa say right there is eschatology and end times, final things, right? And already, to me, there are a couple separate questions about end times or ends, final things. And that is that each of us will face an end, right? There is personal eschatology. What happens when we die? What is the final state of individual beings on the one hand? And on the other hand, what is the end destiny for our whole cosmos, for all of human history? If we separate those two things and we talk about personal eschatology, I would submit that the Hebrew Bible is remarkably consistent in a way that can be surprising for Christians and even for Jews who read it, because what is the state of people when they die, according to 99% of the Hebrew Bible? You die and that's the end. You go to Sheol, this shady underworld where really there's nothing. There's not much. And a couple texts from the Hebrew Bible are more explicit about this than others. And the kind of classic case is the Book of Ecclesiastes, which makes a big problem out of this, that our fate as humans and the fate of animals is one and the same. Who's to say that our spirit rises up to return to its maker? We're all dust, and to dust we return. So that echoes from Ash Wednesday, and it feels right in some ways and obvious to say. And in some ways, I think we appreciate Ecclesiastes is ahead of its time in terms of seeing a kinship of us and other animals, that we share a fate. But for the most part, the Hebrew Bible does not envision individual existence after death. It does not have descriptions of a great last judgment like we get in the New Testament. There's nothing like that. There are a couple passages which gesture at resurrection, but not many. And if I put that out there, here's how I'd sort of make that a problem. And I'm happy to look at a few of these passages if it is of interest to you, but that comment might be old news to all of you. I don't know if it is or if it's not. Because the Old Testament's eschatology is mainly excited about the destiny of the nation of Israel, the destiny of the other nations, and how they will relate to Israel in the end times. And then finally, third main point, the transformations of nature when God comes and dwells with humans and so on. Because that's what the Old Testament itself talks about. I feel like we do justice to scripture by like giving our attention to that, as opposed to like saying, why aren't you talking about this thing I'm very curious about, namely what happens to me when I die, which the Hebrew Bible just doesn't say much about. But before I put aside this first topic, personal eschatology, so we're going to put it aside because the Hebrew Bible puts it aside, I do want to sort of ask a question, something for us to wrestle with maybe. And that is, by the first century AD, by Jesus' time, you recall in the almost all Jews did believe in a personal life after death. So that can be confusing because you say, well, wait a minute, in the Hebrew Bible, there's no real life after death. And yet, by the first century, this is almost part of Orthodox mainstream Judaism, small, lowercase o Orthodox. So it is only the Sadducees who come to Jesus and say, well, by the way, how is life after death possibly going to work? They think they have a clever argument to show him there's no such thing as resurrection. He argues back. But if we had time to fill in the gaps more, I would just say, from the time the last books of the Hebrew Bible are written, where there's not much belief in life after death, to the time of the New Testament, for complicated reasons, more and more Jews come to take it for granted that there is life after death. And they do what we all do, and what we've all done ever since, is they find clever ways to reread their scripture to confirm the view they already hold. But it's worth it just noting that is what happens. And so in the Mishnah, which is part of official Jewish authoritative rabbinic Judaism, it actually says all Israel has a share in the world to come, except for the person who denies that there is resurrection from the dead. So like it's such a central point in the Mishnah, you have to believe in resurrection of the dead, or else you forfeit your share in the world to come. All right. I just want to pause for questions about that, because this is a big part of the discussions in the New Testament. How will the judgment work? And the peoples, there's the sheep and the goats and all this sort of depiction of the last judgment. It's not really there in the Old Testament. Are there questions about that, or concerns or thoughts before we change gears and talk about what the Old Testament is excited about when it comes to eschatology? Yeah, Sean.
Is resurrection the same as life after death?
That's a good question. I think the answer is no. And here's why. Just a 30-second version. Greek thinkers like Plato, like the really big Greek philosophers like Plato, they believed there would be life after death. And they believed it was just your soul that would survive. Your soul was immaterial. And it sort of floated on, lived with the gods. Plato believed in a final judgment. Plato believed in that before Jews started believing in that. And everyone will get paid back for whatever they did that was righteous or unrighteous. It all sounds very Christian if you read Plato's descriptions. He did not think bodies had any part to play in that story. We're done with bodies after death. Christians and Jews insisted that after death, our bodies will be raised. And so my sense is, if you took a poll on the streets of New York and you said, hey, what do Christians think about what happens after you die? The average person would say, Christians think you die and then you go to heaven or you go to hell or whatever. Right away, your spirit does. There's maybe good reasons to think that or something, but by and large, I mean, what we say in the creed and what all the early Christians said is we will be raised, our bodies are raised on the last day. So that they were very insistent on bodily resurrection. And that's actually a really big deal because it was incredibly unpopular. Of all the things the early Christians preached, this was one of the biggest stumbling blocks for their audience. And on a lot of points where you can actually sort of study, when Christians said such and such, let's take 5 things Christians wanted to say. If there was big resistance from the Greco-Roman world, the pagan world, if they encountered big resistance on 5 big points, on 4 of them, they usually modulated their voice. They adjusted it to make it more accessible. And what's really interesting is that on resurrection, Christians just said, no, we cannot budge on this. Bodies are what are raised. Bodies matter. There is no life without a body. And I just mentioned that, one, historically, it's the truth. They really went to the mat for this. Second, I feel like we are in an age right now in the 21st century where we see the wisdom of that early commitment in a way it wasn't always evident, that you hear just, right, talk of embodied existence. And we recognize that our own genders and ethnicity and disability or ability and so on are like so part and parcel of who we are. It starts to be kind of weird to think about what would it mean to be me without any body anyway. So that was more than you asked for, Sean. Broadly speaking, a large camp of people could say there will be life after death. Plato would agree. Most Greeks and Romans would kind of agree. 60% would have agreed. Christians would be part of a subset who said, yes, there will be life after death, and the form of that life after death will be bodily resurrection. That was a very minority view of what life after death would be like. Some other day, we should have a big talk about that, because the arguments they got into were very weird and particular. And the counter arguments, it's actually kind of fascinating, but it's a different topic. And there's not much bodily resurrection in the Old Testament. So we have to discipline ourselves and say, all right, what were they? Any other general questions before I go on about the fact that most of the Hebrew Bible doesn't really imagine any personal existence after death? The psalmist again and again, oh Lord, don't let me go down to Sheol, which is just saying, don't let me die right now. Because if I go down to Sheol, if I die, I will no longer see your face. I will no longer be able to praise you. That's sort of amazing. The psalmist really imagined, for the most part, if I die, that's it. I can't pray to you anymore, which is so different than how we tend to think about what happens when you die. Yes, Ken?
Okay, I always thought that in Judaic culture that God had the power to do anything, that life after death depended on God. If God granted you the life after death, you had it, but there was no guarantee. It's kind of like Yom Kippur, where the book of life, you hope that you will be, written into the book of life, but there's no guarantee.
I think something you said there is really insightful, which is, well, actually, yeah, I'm gonna try to agree with you, and I'll just mention Plato, hopefully for the last time tonight. For Plato, the life after death was almost a matter of physics, if you will. It was automatic because the soul had no parts. It was immaterial, so it couldn't be destroyed. So it just had to live on. But for Jews and for Christians, whatever the form of their belief in life after death, they wanted to say, and they said this explicitly, it is not natural. It's not automatic. It's an act of God resisting the natural decay of all things. It's an act of God recreating. So in that sense, I think you're right on, Ken. It's like, it's by the divine power. It's not just something you're granted. Yeah, let's take one more comment from Meg, and then we'll jump into a couple passages.
Quick question. Will you be talking about Elijah in this context?
Oh, like the return of Elijah?
No, the chariots and horsemen of the Lord, how Elijah went.
Yes. Well, okay. So one of the things that's relevant about Elijah, I wasn't planning to talk about it, but this is a big deal. There's only two people in the whole Hebrew Bible who exit the stage without dying. Elijah is one of them, as you said, because it's the chariots and horsemen of the Lord, and he's taken up in a whirlwind. And who's the other person who doesn't die?
Mary.
Okay.
Enoch. Genesis 5:24 says Enoch walked with God and he was no more, for the Lord took him. That's it. And it doesn't say he died. And everyone else in Genesis, it just says like blah, 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 and he lived 624 years and then he died. And Enoch, there's no death. And that led to the Jewish belief that Enoch and Elijah, because they hadn't died, would come back before the great and terrible day of the coming of the Lord. This is more common with Enoch, and this shows up in the New Testament. The disciples actually ask Jesus in Matthew 17. The disciples say to Jesus, Lord, why do the scribes, that is the learned people, say that Elijah must come first? And Jesus responds to him and says, Elijah has come, and they did to him what they wanted. Can you tell who Jesus is talking about?
John the Baptizer.
John the Baptizer. And if you look closely, John the Baptizer shows up out in the wilderness, and he's dressed like Elijah, and he's acting like Elijah. And both Matthew and Luke, as gospel writers, give a couple little clues to say to the reader, do you notice we're casting him as Elijah? And then Jesus says to the disciples, you know how Elijah had to come back first before the day of the Lord? And Jesus says he has come back. And they did to him whatever they wanted. In other words, they killed him. They treated him badly, like they treat all the prophets. So two people didn't die. They were both supposed to come back before the day of the Lord. One's Elijah. So I don't know if that, and that's why, I mean, it was just today is Passover. So in thinking of our Jewish sisters and brothers, you set the empty seat at the Passover Seder for Elijah, like in case he should come. So he has a place to sit at dinner. Yeah. All right, cool. Good questions. Let me share a document, and I want to look. I'm just going to put it up so we can all see it together. It's just going to be a couple Bible verses, and I want to try to emphasize. I want to look at a couple passages together that highlight major themes that that expect something not merely historical. What I mean by that is, it's one thing to say, for a prophet to say, oh, by the way, Zedekiah, the son of Josiah, he will be a good king for Israel. Well, Zedekiah was one of Josiah's sons, and three of Josiah's other sons had already been king of Israel. That's a very matter-of-fact historical prediction. The next king's going to be better. There's a whole different sort of prediction shot through the prophets that speaks in grander language. And so let's just jump into this one. I'll read a little bit. I'll ask someone else to read the next one, just so you don't hear too much of my voice. But let's try to go passive here. Sorry for the sound of my radiator. What I mean by passive is, like, let's let Isaiah set the stage and see what Isaiah wants to have happen in the future. So in days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house, so that's Mount Zion in Jerusalem, where the temple sits, it shall be established as the highest of the mountains and shall be raised above the hills, and all the nations shall stream to it. Many peoples, many Gentiles shall come and say, let's go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction. The Hebrew word there is Torah. And the word of the Lord will go forth from Jerusalem. God will judge between the nations. God will arbitrate for the many peoples. And here's the part we all know. They'll beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. All right. Here is one representative. Oh, what just happened? One representative piece of prophecy. Because we have a fairly large group, I'm going to highlight a couple things. I wish I could just take hands and have you all highlight them. I'll highlight a couple things and you tell me what else you see. This is really about Israel's corporate future. And by corporate, I mean the whole team. It'd be like if we were saying, make America great again, pardon the expression, bad recent memories. It'd be like saying, there will come a day when America will be the country. That's not about me. It's not about my family. It's not about St. Luke in the fields. It's about the whole country. And most of the big predictions about the end times in the Hebrew Bible are about the people of Israel, God's chosen people. It's not that hard to understand why that would be the case. Throughout most of Israel's history, they were wrestling with a discrepancy between the majesty of God's promises, of the honor of being the one people on earth who know the true God, maker of heaven and earth, and the fact that they were a smaller country than most of their neighbors, and that their neighbors frequently invaded them and beat the tar out of them in battle. And so you're sort of wrestling with, like, in what sense are we like a special nation who knows the one true God? So the reason I say it that way is that Israel's future in the prophet's way of thinking, the destiny of Israel is bound up with the glory of God. And if God's people, Israel, are not exalted in some way so that they're different from the other nations, then it's kind of hurts God's reputation. That's what the prophets care about.
Absolutely. Right.
And I'll make two other points, and then I want to sort of hear some questions or thoughts you have on this. One point I want to make is that in a bunch of Hebrew Bible eschatological passages, there is a tension between what I would call a universalism, something that will be true for all the sons of Adam, all the children of Adam, all humans, and something that will only be true for the special people, Israel. There's a reason these things are bound together, and that is, this passage does one of the best jobs of showing it. Would you say this promise here? Sorry, let me take a deep breath. I have a better way to explain this. We often make a distinction between universalism and particularism or nationalism, right? Still today. If we're worried about universal human rights versus nationals, I don't know, some sort of special things for America. This passage, in many ways, looks like it's just concerned with particularism. We're going to be the best country. Israel will. It will be our mountain, Mount Zion, that will rise above all the other mountains. Everyone else will come to us. So it's particular, but it is also universal. It is not universal in the sense of saying in the last days, everyone will be the same. It's universal in the sense of saying when Israel is finally exalted and all the nations come to Jerusalem to learn from her, that will also be a good day for the Gentiles. It's universal in that way. So that even in the end, the distinction of the Israelites is usually maintained. And I think that's surprising to us as Christian readers. And I think this is a really important thing to understand in Jesus' ministry. Because if you read the Gospel of Matthew, you can see the same particularism and universalism running through the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus says, look, I'm not going to take the children's bread, that is the Israelites' bread, and I'm not going to give it to the Gentiles.
To the dogs, sure.
To the dogs. But the gospel ends with a message of hope for the Gentiles. How are those things held together? My short answer, because we got to stay on topic here, is it's the exact same particularism and universalism. Jesus says to his disciples, if I can get Israel to be who they're meant to be, a light for the nations, what does he say? You are the light of the world. If you will be the right kind of light, it will be a blessing for the nations. Because right now the nations live in darkness. They don't know the God who's the creator. We do. If we can let our light shine, everyone can come and see it. And that will be good for them. The day they come and learn, the day they come and see the light, they'll quit having war. They'll beat their swords into plowshares. So this is a little bit of a subtle thing to teach over Zoom at this late hour of the night, but I think this is really important. That's why he's focused on transforming Israel, not to the exclusion of the nations, but because he hopes that when Israel's light shines, the nations will finally get this blessing. All right, I want to pause. I'm talking a lot, and we're going to look at another passage. Is there anything else you note in this passage you'd like to comment on? I will point out just one other thing. No, I'm gonna restrain myself. If I say that, I'm gonna get on a tangent. It's a tangent that's very dear to me, but I'm gonna leave it. Okay. We're gonna look at a couple other passages, and let me name some themes. Some of you may have watched a little video that got circulated that I made, and I kind of put four main themes. I want you to see a couple of those themes in the upcoming passages. One of the themes is that Israel or God's people will be especially holy. One of those themes is that the 12 tribes will be resettled. They will be returned from exile and brought back together. what are the other two themes? Who can remember? I don't remember. I'll know when I see these passages. Righteousness, the 12 tribes. Well, the Gentiles coming. And we're going to see some sort of ambiguity, because sometimes the stuff that's supposed to happen to the Gentiles, the nations, is pretty negative. And sometimes it's pretty positive. And in fact, if I can go out of order, let's just come down to this passage from Zechariah. There's going to be a lot here, but you're going to get both of those themes at once when it comes to the Gentiles. So just so we hear a different voice for a minute, Bo, could I ask you to read for us? And if you would you read from Zechariah? We're going to come back to the earlier part because there's one of my favorite themes. Would you pick up with Zechariah 14:9 and read through 14:16, please?
Sure. And the Lord will become king over all the earth. On that day, the Lord will be one and his name one. Jerusalem shall remain aloft on its site from the gate of Benjamin to the place of the former gate, to the corner gate, and from the tower of Hananel to the king's wine presses. And it shall be inhabited, for never again shall it be doomed to destruction. Jerusalem shall abide in security. This shall be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the peoples that wage war against Jerusalem. Their flesh shall rot while they are still on their feet. Their eyes shall rot in their sockets, and their tongue shall rot in their mouths.
Just pause there. Sorry, but that's okay. Sorry, I should have given a warning. This is R-rated stuff. This is a horror movie, right? It's really grim. So here's this great last day. Jerusalem, never again. No one else will fight it. So here's the special treatment of the Lord. Anyone who fights against it, it's like that scene from the temple. What was it called? The
Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Raiders, thank you. Raiders of the Lost Ark. They're just going to melt apart. There's the bad part. Skip 13. We're going to get a little more bad, then we're going to get some good for the nations in a very confusing way. So 14:14.
Even Judah will fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the surrounding nations shall be collected, gold, silver, and garments in great abundance. And a plague like this plague shall fall on the horses, the mules, the camels, the donkeys, and whatever animals may be in those camps. Then all who survive of the nations that have come against Jerusalem shall go up year after year to worship the Lord, the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the festival of booths.
We'll just pause there. There's a different note, right? I don't know how to map this out into time and space. It's a weird image. It's a little bit like a vision, right? It is a vision, okay? On the one hand, anyone who fights against the holy people is in trouble, seen right out of the Raiders of the Lost Ark. But we're not done. Zechariah 14:14. The wealth of the nations will come to Jerusalem. This is a big theme. And Zechariah 14:16. The nations that weren't destroyed, that is, they will come up year after year to keep the festival of booths. This is Sukkot. That's the term that's used. Gentiles will celebrate Sukkot. So that's a good thing. I mean, that's at least a universal thing. Finally, even the Gentiles will leave their darkness and will get to partake of the sacred festivals. Now, that may not be a whole lot of hope. This is a more negative passage about the Gentiles than some of the prophets, but this is illustrative. So this is an example, and dozens of passages say something similar, that in the last days, the Gentiles come, they learn the Torah, they start to worship with Israel, they abandon their own ways and they adopt the ways of the people of God. So that's part of the end time scenario. The one other thing I want to note here in this passage, and thank you for reading, Bo, I'll just jump ahead. I know this is a big text, but I wanted to sort of prove all these themes are mingled together. So you should hear some echoes. These are the last two verses, Zechariah 14:20 and 21, the last two verses of Zechariah. You should hear some themes here that you recognize from somewhere in the New Testament, kind of, maybe. On that day, this fateful last day, here's what will be inscribed on the bells of the horses. So this is just commonplace, just the bell. A horse has a bell on it. Your dog has a little whistle or bell or something. Holy to the Lord. And all the cooking pots in the house of the Lord shall be as holy as the bowls in front of the altar. You see this emphasis on holiness. Even a common cooking pot will be as holy as something in the temple. And then every cooking pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be sacred to the Lord. All those who sacrifice may come and use them. And there shall no longer be traders in the house of the Lord of hosts on that day. What does that sound like? Who had a thing against people trading in the house of the Lord? Yeah. The common thread in all four Gospels account is Jesus driving the people trading, buying and selling out of the house of the Lord. I do not pretend to know everything that was going on in Jesus' mind, but it is picking up on this very theme that on the final eschatological day, trade should not be taking place in the temple, that there will be some sort of tremendous holiness in the temple. Okay, I'm going over themes fast, but I'm mindful of the time. I'm going to go back to an earlier passage here in an earlier part of this Zechariah passage. And I'm going to try to tie together something I said in the first lecture I did that you may remember, and some of you wrote to me about it. We have a very erudite crowd here. Some of you have already written your own things about it, but there is a pattern in eschatology which goes under a German term, Urtzeit, which means beginning time, Endzeit. Urtzeit means beginning, Endzeit, end. And it's just to say that there tends to be a certain symmetry in how things are depicted at the end with how they were at the beginning, okay? In light of that, we'll see how well some of you know your Genesis 1. Tell me if you can hear any echoes of the creation story from Genesis 1 as I read the following passages from Zechariah 14, okay? Zechariah says, so there will come this day, the Lord my God will come. So it's the coming of God. Long before there was a parousia of Jesus Christ, there was a parousia of God. God will come and all the holy ones with him. On that day, when God comes, there will not be cold or frost, and there shall be one day. This is a weird day. It is not day and it is not night. There will be light even at the evening. And on that day, living water will flow out from Jerusalem, blah, blah, blah. And it shall continue in summer and at winter. This is pretty subtle. I'm going to give a clearer example of the phenomenon I'm trying to illustrate. But can you think of anything from the creation account in Genesis that this might be hearkening back to?
Second day.
Yes, the days of creation. And let me just say something out loud for you. I'm going to say the first 3 days of creation. You're going to notice an asymmetry. The asymmetry matters. Blah, 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 blah. One day. Yom Echad. See that highlighted there? Blah, blah, blah. God did such and such. The second day. This is the Genesis account. God did such and such a third day. God did such and such a fourth day, a fifth day, a sixth day. What's the difference? Day one, and then the second day, the third day, the fourth day. The asymmetry, the thing that doesn't fit the pattern, is that Genesis could have just said the first day. So all the other days are called the second, the third, the fourth. The very first day in Genesis 1:5 is called just day one. And already in the Hebrew Bible, they were intrigued by that expression. Why is it called day one and not a first day? And the answer that they came up with is that that day was not partaking in time itself. I'm only going on about this because a couple of you, I think, kind of like this idea. I think it's super neat. That if you think about part and parcel of the very idea of the passage of time is of created things moving, right? Like this is an old philosophical problem. Can you have time if there's nothing changing? And the answer that even the ancient Jews and the ancient Greeks came up with is that you really can't. Time at least can't mean anything like what it means for us, which means that day one, it was very insightful of Moses not to call it the first day because it wasn't really part of a sequence yet. It was just day. Time didn't yet exist. So it was day in scare quotes. It wasn't like normal days, which means there was light in this passage. At the end of time, there will also be a day without seasons, with light from the Lord, without times of the day. So I don't know if I've made that clear. Let me just show it in one other place, okay? Bear with me. This next passage will be a little easier to follow. At the top of the screen, I'm sharing Isaiah 60, 18 to 20. Isaiah has so many promises about the end, but here Isaiah says, there'll be no more violence in your land, no more devastation or destruction. Your walls will be called salvation. Your gates will be named praise. And then notice this, the sun shall no longer be your light by day, nor for brightness shall the moon give you light by night. The Lord will be your light. The Lord will be your glory. What's the very first thing God makes in the Genesis account? And God said, let there be light.
Light. Yeah.
And one of the main points of that Genesis creation story is to say that light preceded the creation of the sun and the moon. That's the Genesis creation story is proud of itself and saying, oh yeah, the sun and the moon are great, but we had light way before we had those two astral things. And here you can see Isaiah saying, and at the end, it's like working backwards. No more sun, no more moon, just the light of God. So we could give other examples of this. They're thinking about those creation stories and they're imagining the end to be working backward toward that pure light, no real time, like unity with God. Let me know, I see your hand, John. Let me note two other things and I'll take a few questions. In Genesis, things go from bad to worse in a hurry in Genesis 1 through 6, right? By chapter 6, we've got a universal flood. God's so fed up, God destroys the world in a flood. That's a pretty quick deterioration of things. After the flood, God makes a concession. We spoke about this the last time I was with you. God makes a concession to humans for the first time. And God says, you all can eat meat. Prior to this, you all just ate plants. You can eat meat now. That's a new thing after the flood. What might you expect if the prophets are thinking about rolling the time backwards as things return to God's perfect ideal? Well, I'm sorry to jump around, but here's just Isaiah 66, 25. The wolf and the lamb will feed together. The lion will eat straw. Like there will be no more devouring of animal against animal. That's a beautiful picture, and we know that sort of story well, right? The lion, but part of what the prophets are doing when they describe that is working backwards behind earlier than the flood, before God started making concessions to humans and to animals to let them eat each other. That's one of the reasons the vision of the end is that even a lion will just eat straw for food. And similarly, it's not a mistake that the serpent gets mentioned there, right? Because of course, a serpent features prominently in Genesis 2 and 3 in a kind of unhelpful way. And so likewise, they're continuing to just sort of like think about how were things started. God's plan for the creation will arc back toward this unity. Now, let me pause. I've said a lot of things. I have more. John Calhoun, you were trying to ask a question.
The two words in Greek for time, chronos and kairos, seems to me is reflected in this. Kairos is time so filled with being alive that you're not conscious of chronicity, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock.
Yeah.
It's an intensity of existence that is lacking when we start getting into 2, 3, 4, 5,
Yep.
and the passage of time as we have it. And I'm just wondering whether in the Septuagint, for example, whether there's any use of the two words for time to distinguish between being alive in a way that kind of like drowns out the consciousness of the passage of time, an intensity of aliveness that's reflected, of course, in when the Lord will be our everlasting light.
I know what you're driving at, and it's a good question. I just wrote a paper where I worked a lot on this question. The Greeks actually do less with that distinction between chronos and kairos. They get at that idea. You perfectly described a distinction. They have a lot of ways of expressing that distinction. They don't always do it with just those two words. They tend to do it in other ways.
Okay.
But the distinction stands, and they're very interested in this idea that, well, that day one, I let day one echo in your ears, because you'll see it some other places, like in the New Testament. 2 Peter 3:8 says, day one with the Lord is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like one day.
Yeah.
That's deliberate. That's talking about Genesis 1:5.
Yeah.
It's not just saying like one of our days, it's saying it's like the first day. So we have animals. We have, look, I'm going to run out of time. So let me just draw a couple other points that are precious to me. I just want to say, there's images of a restored cosmos, harmony among animals, extended life. A lot of the Old Testament eschatology is corporate. It's about the people of Israel. There is usually a benefit for all the other peoples. Like, it is good for me, Jeremy, as a Gentile, when God lifts up God's own people, Israel. It's good for me because I'm going to bask in the light of Zion. So it's not, so the particularism lives right to the end, but it becomes a universalism because everyone gets to come live in that light and learn the law of the Lord. And maybe I better stop trying to say summary things, because I may just run out of time. I will say this. I think if you go through some of these passages with some care, Isaiah 60 speaks about the kings of the earth bringing gold and frankincense to Israel. It's not a mistake in Matthew 2 that the Magi come with gold and frankincense. That's exactly what is supposed to happen when God starts to like make the light of Israel shine. And of course, how do the Magi find the baby Jesus? They follow a light that they see shining over Palestine. And so what Matthew is doing is saying, you know, that old prediction that's in Isaiah 60, that's in Psalm 72, that the kings from the ends of the earth will start to bring their wealth and they'll come to worship the light here. That was happening in the baby Jesus. These are the themes that the gospel writers are very intimately acquainted with, and that were live issues in the first century in Jesus' ministry. And I think it's hard for us to understand Jesus unless we let him be an eschatological teacher. And so when he says Moses permitted you to divorce, but it was not so from the beginning, that's him saying, I want to be kind of like the prophets, kind of like Isaiah said, there will come a day when lions won't eat flesh anymore. Jesus is saying, let's try to bring that day forward. Let's start it now in our group. What are these ideals? And he's looking to the creation stories for those ideals that will be fully brought to bear in kind of in unimaginable ways in the future, in the end times, in the eschaton, but that are, bit by bit brought forward now, and that Jesus is urging people to like put into practice as if to kind of force God's cosmic clock. All right. Speaking of clocks, I'm going to run out of time if I keep going. Are there some other questions or maybe things I've just forgotten to say that are like should be major points that I'm just omitting? Ken, you had another question?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment and see if you've come across this. But you mentioned that Jesus, that there was something in the passage about the traders in the temple, and they were defiling the temple or whatever, they shouldn't be there. And I've read that this was obviously a reference to the money changers that were the den of thieves in the New Testament, that Jesus overturned the tables and all, and that they were there because there was something like 70 currencies floating around, and they had to be changed into a single currency to pay their taxes.
You are correct.
And so they were deliberately in the temple because that was the central place of the whole country, and so that's why they were there. Is that true?
Yeah, it's true. And I didn't really yes. And so the reason I brought that passage up, which I didn't really mean to, because it's a Jesus activity in the temple, the cleansing of the temple is itself a kind of, it's not that obvious what is going on in that story. Here's why I brought it up, is you are correct that the money changers were supposed to be there. They were offering a service. And so if we were going to dive into that passage, one of the things we ought to struggle with is, hey, Jesus, what's the problem? They're not doing anything criminal. And the reason then I bring in that passage from Zechariah is that is one of the possible answers to what Jesus is doing. So let me word it the other way. Let's imagine Jesus is using things like Zechariah 14 as almost a script. If I am the eschatological agent of God, if Jesus says that about himself, I am God's agent for this final action. One of the things many of these passages speak about is the perfect holiness of the temple. And if one of those passages, if Zechariah 14 is so specific as to say, there will be no traitors in the temple, I don't think it's crazy to imagine Jesus doing a demonstration to say, hey, no traitors in the temple. Not so much because, oh, you guys were doing something especially nasty, but because that's supposed to be, in the end, it's supposed to be exceptionally holy. So holy that you just don't do ordinary stuff there. Right. I don't know if that's right or wrong, to be honest. It's a complicated issue. I just mention it because you can see the train of thought.
Yeah.
Let me say one other thing of like as you all go forward in your study of the Bible, your study of the New Testament, you will get a lot of illumination or mileage if you ask yourself the following question, like with the Apostle Paul. If you read Isaiah chapters 40 through 66, now that's a lot, but you can read it in an afternoon, and it's beautiful stuff. Isaiah has a sweeping kind of like cascading images of what will happen in the end times. People will preach about the true God. They will preach to the nations. They will go to the farthest reaches. If you read those passages, and then you imagine the Apostle Paul, who's such a strange individual, and you say, what if Paul read those passages and he just said to himself, I'm going to be this guy. Everything Isaiah is predicting, I'm going to get a posse together and we're going to do it. I'll tell you what, a bunch of things from Paul's activity will fall into place for you. In other words, I'll just tell you what I think. That is what Paul was doing. Paul was saying, aha, here is the playbook for the end times. And Paul then comes to the belief that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, whom God has raised. Paul becomes convinced these are the end times. And Paul says, okay, so what's supposed to happen in the end times? And he looks at a passage like the one we just read. The word of God is supposed to go forth from Zion. How blessed are the feet of those who spread the good news. That's Isaiah 50. Paul quotes it in Romans. Paul basically like gets his whole idea for a worldwide mission from those last chapters of Isaiah. And he's trying to like bring the end times that Isaiah promised into focus through his activity. So these are big sweeping topics. I'm sorry to deal with them in quick fashion. I will say just from my concluding thoughts, one of the difficult things about reading the prophets is I hanker for a certain amount of order and coherence in the end of the day. I love poetry, but I find some of the visions confusing because they will involve contradictions. So if this group were to sit down and say, we're going to spend a week just on Zechariah 14, and then a week just on Isaiah 60, with every single chapter we looked closely at, there would be some things that would confuse us because it's not quite chronologically possible, and the images create their own contradictions and so on. And I think that's okay. It probably doesn't bother you all as much as it bothers me. I'm probably overly literal. And to some degree, that's just the prophets creating visions, right? Of and you still get the upshot of what they think God is going to do. Father Bo, do you have concluding questions or things you would like to sort of see said before as we wrap up?
No, thank you. I realize I gave you a sort of impossible brief.
It is a big topic to do the eschatology of the Old Testament.
Yeah. But I particularly appreciate your focus on day one, the sort of reconstitution of creation back into sort of the place before time, before creation fell in Christian thought. And I think that leaves a lot of room for connection with where we've, not in a perfectly straight line, but sort of organically been moving toward understanding sort of what the whole point and purpose of all of this thought is.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, to me, some of those Hebrew Bible passages, they do feel like, I mean, here's a line from Paul that the church fathers really loved. In the end, God. Or in the end, God is all in all. Like for Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, that's where it finally all circles back to. And that doesn't have to be the very last word on eschatology, but it's one that really struck ancient Christians as precious, and they wanted to do their thinking that way. I think these Hebrew Bible passages are already thinking that way, right? Like, wait, God makes light before there's ever a sun and moon. So what about if there's just God and us? And what about, well, before the sun and moon, there's no time. So they're already thinking about like, what if it's just in the end, God is all in all? And that leaves some like imponderable questions because like, well, but you can see what it's driving at. And we do reach a point here at some point where it's going to transcend what words can do, right? What there will be truths that cannot be expressed in analytic philosophy, probably. And that's to the detriment of the incapacities of analytic philosophy, not to the detriment of the truths that are being expressed. So, but we never want to punt to mystery too soon. Okay, I'm just rambling now.
Could I just say one thing? I
Bruce,
just want to
please.
thank, just very briefly, I want to say thank you. As you began your talk, I was wondering, and you have answered it in spades, and we're not going to, but my question was going to be about Jewish eschatology and relationship to the Eastern Church's conception of Christ in the inauguration of the eighth age or the eighth day.
Oh, yeah.
Or the boy, have you spoken to that in spades. Thank you very much.
I didn't realize I'd spoken to it, but good. I'm relieved if I have in some way.
Well,
Yeah.
you've illuminated all these different texts that out of which that tradition becomes so powerful, and
Yeah.
faith and iconography certainly was in the Eastern churches. Thank you.
You bet.
For
Thank you,
Paul,
Bruce.
for Paul is coming to Christ, coming to the temple of the eschaton. In Johannine theology,
Yeah.
Jesus, the risen one becomes the temple.
Yeah, that's right. For Paul, yeah. Yeah, he does. And he says, we are the temple of God. And he draws implications from that. So you get that in 2 Corinthians 6 through the beginning of 2 Corinthians 7. Those are themes for Paul. You really, you probably are all going to be exhausted about eschatology, but Paul's eschatology needs a little space of its own. It's very subtle. I'll leave you with this big thought. You all are some big thinkers. Just, this is true, what I'm about to say. I'm very confident in this. One of the hardest things about Paul's eschatology is for everyone who believed in a resurrection. The general resurrection is the thing that happens on the last day, capital L, capital D. On the last day, the archangel sounds his trumpet and the dead are raised. Boom, end of, that's the end of human history. There isn't supposed to be a resurrection. Resurrection doesn't happen piecemeal. You don't get to do one in AD 30 in Palestine and then all the others on the last day. And it's very clear that Paul really thinks that Jesus' resurrection is like the beginning of that one final end times resurrection. But that's temporally impossible. So that means something from the future, the thing that will be the last event of human history, which is the general resurrection of all the dead, in Paul's commitments, that has already started. It happened in one person, in Jesus Christ. And for Paul, that means everyone who is baptized into Christ not only has a kind of, they're not only seated with him in the heavens. For whatever reason, that vertical metaphor is easy for us, right? In some sense, we have one foot with the risen Christ in heaven. But more important for Paul is we have one foot in the future. Because that is, Christ is already partaking of the last event. And that, if that sounds like science fiction, that is deliberate. Like that is the language of science fiction, but it's not gibberish. Because you can start to piece together, like what would the ethics look like if you were committed to that? And would you say things like, don't be conformed to this time period? Because you're already part and parcel of a future coming time period. Well, Paul does say things like that. So what I mean is if you latch on to that very strange belief, you can see a bunch of corollaries that would come from it. And those corollaries are in fact affirmed by Paul. And you're like, aha, I kind of have my finger on your pulse now. I see how you're thinking. Anyway, sorry, that's a totally different topic. Sorry, guys.
I I think it's a good note to end on for this evening. Thank you,